November 26, 1943. Skies above Bremen, Germany. The pencil trembled slightly in Major Hub Zemke's hand as he recorded the mission in his logbook after landing. Words that would have seemed impossible just 8 months earlier, when experienced RAF pilots had openly questioned whether the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt could survive against nimble German fighters. Through the frost-covered canopy at 31,000 feet, he had watched his 56th Fighter Group execute a maneuver that contradicted every assumption about aerial combat doctrine learned from the First World War. Instead of turning horizontally to engage the enemy, his pilots had rolled inverted and plunged straight down at speeds approaching 525 miles per hour, a velocity that would have torn the wings off any other fighter in the European theatre. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s never saw death approaching from directly above. One moment they were climbing confidently toward the vulnerable Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, and the next moment 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns were pouring devastating fire into their cockpits from fighters that appeared out of the sun like thunderbolts from Zeus himself. The mathematics of aerial supremacy were being rewritten not in turning radius or rate of climb, but in the terrifying physics of a nearly 8-ton fighter achieving terminal velocity in a controlled dive, then using that accumulated kinetic energy to zoom climb back to altitude, where thin air and turbocharging gave American pilots an insurmountable advantage. The transformation had begun on April 13, 1943, when the 56th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission, a fighter sweep over Saint-Omer in occupied France. The pilots were nervous. They had trained for 9 months on the P-47 Thunderbolt, but many remained skeptical about the aircraft's combat potential. At nearly 14,000 pounds fully loaded with standard combat configuration, and up to 17,500 pounds with external stores, the Thunderbolt was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. It outweighed the graceful Supermarine Spitfire by 6,500 pounds and dwarfed the Focke-Wulf FW-190 by 5,000 pounds. Critics called it a milk bottle. Detractors nicknamed it the 7-ton milk jug, shortened eventually to simply the Jug. RAF pilots who had successfully defended Britain in nimble Spitfires openly questioned whether such a massive aircraft could survive against experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying agile German fighters. Among the doubters was Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, fresh from pilot training and terrified he would die in his first week of combat. The journey from skepticism to mastery began at Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, where Georgian engineer Alexander Kartveli had designed something radically different from every other fighter in existence. Kartveli had famously sketched the P-47 design on a napkin, later describing his creation with characteristic humor as a dinosaur, but a dinosaur with good proportions. The P-47 was built around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, generating 2,000 horsepower at sea level at rated power, with water injection boosting output to 2,300 horsepower for combat emergencies. This immense power drove a massive 4-bladed propeller that spun with such force that at high speeds the tips approached the speed of sound. Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, studied the aircraft's capabilities with scientific precision. "We have to stop fighting the way everyone thinks we should fight," he told his pilots during a briefing in early June 1943. "The Thunderbolt isn't a Spitfire. It will never outmaneuver a 109 or a 190. But it can do something they cannot. It can dive faster than anything in the sky, and nothing in the Luftwaffe can catch us if we use that advantage." November 13, 1942, Wright Field, Ohio. The altimeter needle swept past 35,000 feet as Lieutenants Harold Comstock and Roger Dyer pushed their P-47C Thunderbolts into near-vertical dives during high-altitude performance testing. What happened next would fundamentally redefine aerial combat and prove crucial to understanding the P-47's true capabilities and limitations. Their airspeed indicators climbed past 500 mmf, past 600, eventually showing 725 mmf indicated airspeed. The actual true airspeed was certainly lower, likely in the 550 to 600 mm range, because pitot-static instruments become increasingly inaccurate at high speeds and high altitudes. Republic Aviation would later claim the pilots had exceeded the speed of sound, making them the first humans to break the sound barrier. This claim was disputed by many aviation experts, and General Henry Hap Arnold sent a telegram to Republic ordering there would be no more discussion about the dive. Beyond approximately 550 mph indicated airspeed, both pilots encountered severe compressibility effects as localized airflow over the wings approached transonic velocities. The controls became rigid, completely unresponsive to normal stick inputs. The aircraft were diving nearly straight down, accelerating continuously, and conventional recovery seemed impossible. Both pilots experienced tunnel vision from the G-forces and genuine terror as their aircraft plunged earthward with frozen controls. But Comstock and Dyer both managed to recover, and their technique would be taught to every P-47 pilot who followed. The critical procedure required pushing firmly on the control stick with both hands while keeping the trim tabs locked in neutral position. Pilots were explicitly warned never to adjust trim tabs during compressibility recovery, as over-control would likely result when the aircraft descended into denser air and controls suddenly regained effectiveness. Both test pilots bottomed out their recoveries with less than 2,000 feet to spare, their bodies compressed into their seats by forces exceeding 8 times gravity. When they landed and reported their experience, the response was immediate and thorough. Every P-47 pilot would receive extensive training in recognizing compressibility onset and executing proper recovery procedures. More importantly, engineers discovered that the P-47's thick wing design, which made it a poor turner compared to thinner-winged fighters, actually delayed the onset of critical compressibility effects. The Thunderbolt could dive faster and recover more reliably than any contemporary fighter. This capability was made possible by the P-47's sophisticated turbocharger system buried deep in the rear fuselage, the key to everything the aircraft could achieve. Exhaust gases were piped along both sides of the cockpit through extensive ducting to drive a General Electric turbine mounted in the belly, spinning at 21,300 revolutions per minute at full power. This turbine compressed incoming air and fed it back to the engine through an intercooler system that lowered temperatures and increased density. The result was revolutionary. The system allowed the R-2800 to produce maximum power at 27,000 feet, and at 30,000 feet in the thin stratosphere, where other fighters gasped for oxygen, the Thunderbolt remained faster and more powerful than any German fighter. The P-47 could operate effectively up to its service ceiling of 42,000 feet, an altitude where Luftwaffe pilots found their aircraft struggling for performance. Colonel Zemke studied these technical findings with scientific precision, recognizing their tactical implications immediately. He gathered his squadron commanders and explained the physics that would transform aerial combat. Altitude is potential energy. In a dive, that potential energy converts to kinetic energy, speed that no German fighter can match. When we dive at 500 miles per hour, we control the engagement completely. We can hit and run before they can react. By late spring 1943, Zemke had distilled this insight into a simple directive that would become the 56th Fighter Group's combat doctrine: never turn when you can dive. June 12, 1943. Skies over the Belgian coast. Captain Walter V. Cook of the 61st Fighter Squadron spotted a Focke-Wulf FW-190 at lower altitude near Blankenberg, Belgium. Following the altitude advantage doctrine that Colonel Hubert Zemke had been drilling into his pilots, Cook dove on the unsuspecting German fighter, fired a burst from his .850 caliber guns, and watched the FW-190 tumble toward the ground trailing smoke. It was the 56th Fighter Group's first confirmed aerial victory, and it had been achieved using the diving attack that would become their trademark. The very next day, June 13, 1943, brought the 56th Fighter Group 3 more victories and validated the tactics Zemke had been developing. Lieutenant Robert Johnson scored his first kill that day, diving from altitude onto an FW-190 over Bruges, France. The German pilot never saw him coming. Johnson fired a precise burst, saw strikes on the enemy fighter, and watched it spin into the ground. When Johnson landed, Major General Carl Spaatz, commanding the 8th Air Force, personally presented him with a bottle of Scotch whisky to mark the occasion of being among the first 8th Air Force pilots to score victories in the new P-47. However, Johnson also learned a harsh lesson that day. His element leader had not followed to provide cover during the attack, and Johnson found himself isolated and under attack by multiple German fighters. He was simultaneously reprimanded by his commanders, including Zemke and Captain Gerald W. Johnson, for breaking formation during the engagement, even though his kill was confirmed. The incident highlighted the critical importance of tactical discipline. Diving attacks required coordinated execution and mutual support. Individual glory meant nothing if pilots were lost to enemy fighters during or after their attack runs. The missions through late April and into May 1943 were cautious operations. Fighter sweeps over the coast, learning the terrain, testing equipment, and building experience gradually without rushing into major engagements that could devastate an inexperienced unit. But nothing prepared the pilots for what they would soon experience in actual combat. On June 26, 1943, during escort duty for B-17 bombers returning from a mission to Villers-Cotterêts, France, 48 P-47Cs of the 56th Fighter Group were bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf FW-190s of Jagdgeschwader 26 near Forges-les-Eaux. The engagement would prove both costly and educational. Lieutenant Johnson's P-47C, nicknamed Half Pint, was hit early in the fight by multiple 20mm cannon shells. His canopy shattered. Hydraulic lines were severed, spraying fluid across his windscreen. The cockpit caught fire briefly. Shrapnel from exploding cannon shells struck Johnson's nose, causing bleeding and partial disorientation. Most pilots would have abandoned the aircraft immediately, but Johnson discovered his canopy would not open, trapping him in the dying fighter. With no choice but to fly or die, Johnson pushed the nose down and dove for the English Channel at maximum speed. An FW-190 followed, firing repeatedly into the already crippled P-47C. More cannon shells tore through Johnson's wings and fuselage. The German pilot apparently expended all his ammunition on the defenseless American fighter, then flew alongside, looked directly at Johnson, saluted, and broke away. Whether this represented respect for courage or simply acknowledgement that further attacks were pointless, Johnson never knew. But the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine continued running despite taking multiple hits. The robust airframe designed with thick structural members and redundant systems held together despite catastrophic damage. Johnson coaxed the battered P-47C across the English Channel, found RAF Manston Emergency Airfield, and executed a perfect landing despite having almost no forward visibility through the hydraulic fluid-coated windscreen. Ground crews counted over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes in the aircraft. Yet Johnson walked away with only minor injuries, and remarkably, the P-47C was eventually repaired and returned to service. After this mission, Johnson would tell his fellow pilots, "The P-47 wasn't invincible, but it could bring you home when nothing else could." August 17, 1943. Skies above Regensburg, Germany. The 8th Air Force launched 376 heavy bombers in a daring double strike against ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and aircraft production facilities at Regensburg, deep in Germany. The bombers would fly hundreds of miles beyond the escort range of most Allied fighters. The P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group were assigned to provide penetration escort for the Regensburg force, taking the bombers as far as their fuel allowed, before turning back toward England. Major Francis Gabreski, leading elements of the 61st Fighter Squadron, positioned his flights at 30,000 feet, 5,000 feet above the bomber stream. German fighters were climbing from multiple airfields across northern France and Belgium, approximately 40 Bf-109s and FW-190s in several formations, timing their arrival to catch the bombers when P-47 escorts would be at the limit of their fuel range. What the German pilots did not expect was the coordinated diving attack from superior altitude. Multiple P-47 flights rolled inverted simultaneously, pointed their noses at steep dive angles between 45 and 60 degrees, and accelerated toward the climbing German fighters at speeds the Luftwaffe pilots had never encountered in combat from American fighters. The engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes and spread across 70 miles of German and Belgian airspace. P-47 pilots executed textbook diving attacks, struck hard, and recovered to altitude for repeated attacks. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 16 German fighters destroyed, 9 damaged, and 1 probable for the loss of 3 P-47s. German records documented 22 aircraft lost that day across all units, with 11 pilots killed and 8 more wounded. Among the dead was Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, Gruppenkommandeur of the 2nd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 26, brother of the famous General Adolf Galland. Galland had scored 55 victories before encountering P-47 diving tactics he could not counter. The psychological impact on remaining Jagdgeschwader 26 pilots was profound. One of their most experienced leaders had been killed by tactics he never saw coming. More importantly for the strategic picture, the bomber stream lost far fewer aircraft than expected during the period when P-47 escort was present. The Thunderbolts had proven they could protect the bombers that were systematically destroying Germany's ability to wage war. October 1943 brought the full maturation of P-47 diving tactics and demonstrated kill ratios that would have seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. The missions that month showed what properly trained pilots using correct doctrine could achieve. On October 4, 1943, during an escort mission to Frankfurt, the 56th Fighter Group encountered approximately 60 German fighters attempting to intercept the bomber stream near Cologne. Using altitude advantage and disciplined diving attacks, the 56th destroyed approximately 15 Bf-110 twin-engine fighters along with single-engine fighters, claiming 16 total victories while losing 2 P-47s to anti-aircraft fire rather than enemy fighters. The combat physics were undeniable. A P-47 at 30,000 feet had potential energy equivalent to 9.4 million foot-pounds. When diving to 20,000 feet, this converted to kinetic energy producing speeds approaching or exceeding 500 mph. No German fighter could safely match this speed. The FW-190's maximum dive speed was limited to approximately 450 mph indicated airspeed before structural concerns became critical. The Bf-109 faced similar limitations with additional control difficulties at high speeds. After firing on a target at 20,000 feet, a P-47 pilot pulling 4 to 5 G in the recovery could zoom climb back to 28,000 or 29,000 feet, using accumulated kinetic energy. The entire attack cycle from 30,000 feet down to 20,000 feet and back up to 28,000 feet consumed less than 90 seconds and required minimal fuel. A German fighter attempting to climb from 20,000 feet to 30,000 feet required 4 to 6 minutes and consumed significant fuel while the pilot's engine lost power continuously as altitude increased. By the end of October 1943, the kill ratios achieved by the 56th Fighter Group approached 11 to 1 when considering only aircraft lost to enemy fighters in air combat. Even when including all operational losses from mechanical failures, weather, and ground fire, the ratio remained above 5 to 1. When examining only engagements where P-47 pilots maintained altitude discipline and followed diving attack doctrine, kill ratios exceeded 15 to 1. February 20, 1944. Skies over Germany. Operation Argument began, known to participants as Big Week, 6 days of maximum effort bombing raids against German aircraft production facilities. The 8th Air Force launched over 3,000 heavy bomber sorties, and the Luftwaffe responded with everything available. The 56th Fighter Group flew 16 major missions during Big Week and the immediate aftermath, logging more combat hours than any other fighter group. The diving tactics perfected over 9 months of combat were now being executed by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience against German pilots with decreasing experience levels. The results during this period were devastating for the Luftwaffe. Through Big Week and into the first half of March, the 56th Fighter Group destroyed approximately 87 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, far exceeding previous monthly totals. On February 20th, during an escort to Leipzig, they destroyed 15 German fighters without loss. On February 22nd, escorting bombers to Halberstadt, they destroyed 12 more. The accumulated effect of these losses broke the Luftwaffe's ability to effectively defend German airspace in daylight. German fighter units were losing experienced pilots faster than training programs could produce replacements. New German pilots arrived at operational units with minimal flight time, often less than 50 hours in type, compared to American pilots arriving with 150 to 200 hours of flight training. These inexperienced German pilots were particularly vulnerable to P-47 diving attacks. They lacked the situational awareness to see attackers coming from above. They made mistakes in defensive maneuvering. They panicked and dove away reflexively, playing directly into the P-47's greatest strength. The psychological effect on Luftwaffe pilots became measurably significant by early 1944. German combat reports increasingly mentioned avoiding engagement with P-47s above 25,000 feet. Some squadrons began refusing to climb to high altitude altogether, concentrating their efforts on attacking bombers during their initial climb or final descent, when P-47 escort was less effective. But this exposed German fighters to defensive fire from the bombers and reduced attack effectiveness. Major Erich Hartmann, who would eventually become the highest-scoring ace in aviation history with 352 confirmed victories, later provided insight into German tactical thinking. In post-war interviews, Hartmann explained that by late 1943, experienced German pilots recognized the P-47 was most dangerous when it had altitude advantage. American pilots were learning to use their aircraft correctly, Hartmann recalled, refusing to be lured down to altitudes where German fighters had turning and acceleration advantages. Instead, P-47s attacked repeatedly from above. Diving so fast German pilots could barely track them visually, firing quick bursts and climbing away before effective response was possible. The psychological terror was indescribable, Hartmann admitted. You would be climbing to engage the bombers and suddenly your wingman would explode beside you. You would look up and see American fighters diving nearly vertically at impossible speeds. By the time you reacted, they were already pulling up and climbing away, completely untouchable. You could not catch them climbing. You could not evade them diving. You could only hope they would choose a different target next time. The diving tactics required exceptional physical conditioning and technique. Pulling out of a 500 Mach dive generated G-forces exceeding 7 times gravity. Blood drained from the brain toward the lower body. Vision narrowed to a tunnel. Some pilots lost consciousness briefly at the bottom of their dives, recovering only as the aircraft naturally began to level off. To counter this, P-47 pilots developed anti-G straining techniques borrowed from dive bomber operations. They would tense leg muscles and abdominal muscles vigorously during the pullout, effectively raising blood pressure and helping maintain blood flow to the brain. They would grunt or shout loudly, forcing air pressure into their lungs and chest cavity. They learned to limit their pullout to 6 to 6.5 G when possible, accepting a slightly shallower recovery angle to reduce blackout risk while still achieving effective zoom climb performance. By March 1944, air superiority over Germany was largely achieved. German fighters still appeared, but in smaller numbers and with noticeably less aggressive tactics. On March 6, 1944, the 56th Fighter Group flew escort all the way to Berlin and back without encountering a single German fighter willing to engage at high altitude. April 1945. Over the skies of Europe. From April 1943 through April 1945, the 56th Fighter Group flew 447 combat missions. They achieved 674.5 confirmed aerial victories, more than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force. They lost 60 aircraft to enemy fighters in air-to-air combat, producing a kill ratio of 11.2 to 1. When including all operational losses, totaling 128 aircraft from all causes including mechanical failures, weather and ground fire, the kill ratio remained approximately 5.3 to 1. These statistics represented not just numbers, but lives saved and missions accomplished. Every German fighter destroyed meant one less threat to the bomber streams. Every bomber protected meant crews survived to fly again and targets were destroyed. The strategic bombing campaign succeeded in large part because P-47s achieved air superiority over Germany, allowing bombers to systematically destroy the industrial capacity sustaining the German war effort. Individual pilots achieved remarkable records using tactics developed through the 56th Fighter Group's experience. Francis Gabreski's 28 victories all came in P-47s. Robert Johnson's 27 victories were all achieved in P-47s. David Schilling scored 22.75 victories in P-47s. Walker Mahurin achieved 21 victories with the 56th before transferring to other duties. All of these aces credited their success to diving attack tactics developed by Zemke and refined through hundreds of combat missions. The P-47's overall performance across all theaters validated the diving attack approach. The Thunderbolt flew over 746,000 sorties of all types during World War II. It achieved an aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1 while losing 3,499 aircraft to all causes in combat. This overall ratio masked substantial variation between units and theaters. Groups that consistently employed proper high-altitude diving tactics achieved kill ratios between 8 to 1 and 15 to 1. Units that deviated from doctrine or operated primarily at low altitudes, where the P-47's disadvantages were exposed, achieved much lower ratios. The lessons learned with the P-47 influenced fighter design and doctrine for decades afterward. Post-war analysis confirmed that boom and zoom tactics, exploiting superior speed and energy management, were fundamentally more effective than traditional turning dogfights when facing comparable opponents. The jet fighters that followed, including the F-86 Sabre that achieved success in Korea and the F-100 Super Sabre that followed, emphasized speed, climb rate, and energy tactics over turning capability. Francis Gabreski flew F-86 Sabres in Korea, applying the same energy management principles he learned in P-47s over Germany. He shot down 6.5 MiG-15s in Korea, making him one of only 7 American pilots to achieve ace status in 2 different wars. The tactics that worked against FW-190s and Bf-109s over Germany worked equally well against MiG-15s over Korea. Maintain altitude advantage, dive on the enemy at high speed. Fire a quick burst, zoom, climb back to safety. The aircraft and speeds changed, but the fundamental tactical principles remained valid. Modern computer simulations using authentic flight models and performance data have confirmed what P-47 pilots discovered through combat experience. In engagements where the P-47 maintained altitude discipline and used diving attacks exclusively, kill ratios exceeded 20 to 1 against comparable German fighters. Only when P-47 pilots violated doctrine and engaged in low-altitude turning fights did German fighters achieve favorable exchange ratios. Colonel Hubert Zemke, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group during its critical development period and established the tactical doctrine that made it successful, later reflected on the transformation. When I took command in September 1942, he wrote in his post-war memoir, I had an aircraft that everyone said was wrong for the mission and pilots who were terrified they would be slaughtered by experienced German pilots. I had to find what the P-47 could do well and build tactics around those capabilities. The dive became everything. We could dive faster than anyone. We could recover from dives that would kill other pilots. We could zoom, climb back to altitude and do it again. Once we mastered this, we became unstoppable. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt and its diving tactics is ultimately a story about the triumph of analysis over assumption, discipline over improvisation, and physics over tradition. The P-47 pilots started diving straight down because analysis showed it was the most effective way to attack. They achieved kill ratios approaching 20-1 in ideal conditions because physics and proper tactics are more powerful than courage and tradition. The answer was not courage, though courage was required. The answer was superior tactics, rigorously based on physics and executed with unwavering discipline. That combination proved unstoppable,